we have a really interesting sort of deep dive into emergency departments today. And I want to thank very much the panelists. These are folks who are extremely busy, 24 hours a day, taking care of patients who are coming through the ED. And as many of you know, the ED is the front door to the hospital. In many instances, the majority of inpatients come through the ED. So it's a busy place. Let me read through the panelists, and this is the order in which they're going to speak. We have Alan Flanagan, who's the Chief of Emergency Medicine at Catholic Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire. We have Joan Doyle, who's the Director of Infection Prevention and Control at Haywood Hospital. We have Malcolm Creighton, who's the Division Chair of Hospital-Based Specialties and Department Chair of Emergency Medicine at BI Lahey. We have David Huckins, who's the Newton Wellesley Emergency Department President of the Medical Staff and Interim Chair of the ED. We have Bob Seeger, who's the Executive Director of Emergency Medicine at Mass General. We have Brian Yun, who's the Director of Clinical Operations in Emergency Medicine at Mass General. Arjun Venkatesh, who's the Chief and the Section Administrator, Associate Professor, Department of Emergency Medicine at Yale. And then we're going to have a couple of comments from architects who work regularly with hospitals and ED staff, Sarah Markovitz from NVBJ and Ron Gorham from Perkins and Will. We've asked the speakers to try and keep their comments to around 3 minutes, and that will give us some time at the end for a discussion. The question is a very simple one, and it's on the premise that pandemics are here to stay. So on the basis of learnings over the past 18 months, how might you organize, plan an ED differently if you were starting from scratch with a clean sheet of paper today? And to begin the discussion, and by the way, we've organized the speaking order by community hospitals first, and then leading up to the academic medical centers. So it's going to give us a range of perspectives. So Alan Flanagan, if you're ready, please proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invite. So I'm the chief at the emergency department here at Catholic Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire. Our volume is about 35,000 pre-pandemic. It's a 28-bed emergency department that's sort of designed with a nice circle with two offshoots. One was initially as a fast track, but we never use it that way because our acuity is so high that we basically have any patient anywhere, including hallway beds, which bumps our numbers up to about 40 beds at a time. With the onset of the pandemic, our biggest concern was our only negative pressure room is deep in the middle of the emergency department, not in any way, shape, or form in the periphery. So if we actually had a person that was airborne pathogen that we thought COVID was at the time, or we weren't sure, they had to go all the way through the emergency department to get to the negative pressure room. And we realized very quickly that this was something that we did not want to do. And we tried to partition off our emergency department, but that was very difficult given this circular configuration that we had. We do have an observation unit that was built a couple years ago that's just off the posterior, the backside of the emergency department, which we actually decided to utilize as our containment area when we first started. And we divided that into a warm and cold zone, or a hot and warm zone, I guess you would. Ultimately, nothing was easy to do. Putting tape down the middle of the hallway to show where the contaminated versus non-contaminated equipment and personnel would walk and move was something we tried to do, but really we were not prepared for this. Ironically, though, we're now in the process of building designing a new emergency department, which is going to essentially double our square footage. And the way it's being built, although not ideal for overall operations, it's almost two circles that are side by side. It will provide us with an opportunity to really be able to deal with a pandemic or some other sort of high contamination or hazmat situation where we will have the potential to divide the ED. For day-to-day operations, not the best thing. in terms of patient flow, but if we ever and when we do experience another situation such as the COVID pandemic, I think we'll be ready for it. In addition, we've decided to increase the number of negative pressure rooms, but we found that one of the architectural limits is that per guidelines, negative pressure rooms are supposed to have an individual bathroom as well. And that's, takes away a huge amount of space. And so we're trying to look at what the alternatives are. And that's where we think there might be a real value of having architectural input to see how can we design multiple negative pressure rooms, but not have to sacrifice so much space with individual bathrooms within each room. But any questions, I'm happy to take at the end. Thank you for letting me participate.
Thanks very much, Alan. Some interesting observations there, which we're keeping track of, and I expect we'll probably hear some of the same from others. Next up, Joan Doyle, who's our Director of Infection Control at Haywood Hospital. Hi, Joan.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm Joan Doyle. I'm presently the Director of Infection Prevention and Control at Haywood Hospital. Last year, however, during the start and the height of the pandemic until about February of 2021, I was the Emergency Department Director. I'm here at Haywood Hospital, and we're a 20-bed ED. It's sort of set up in a very large rectangle. So it's just a wide open space with all the rooms on the periphery. We do have one small hallway that has 3 rooms down, which is our, less acute or our fast track area. But as a community hospital, our fast track population never really met the design of that. So we just sort of see everybody whenever, wherever we have space. We're pretty lucky to have 2 negative pressure rooms in our ED, which was key for us during the pandemic. The biggest challenge for us, I think, was that we couldn't use our trauma rooms anymore. So one of the biggest sort of design challenges is the trauma space. So I don't know how everybody else's trauma rooms are set up, but basically it's kind of a big room. You could have 2 or 3 patients in there, depending, and all of the equipment is just wide open. So, when you have infectious patients come in, well, now you have potential exposure for all of your equipment. So, we had to design ways to get that equipment sort of behind barriers so that it could remain protected if we needed to use the trauma space. But we ended up, basically turning our negative pressure rooms into our trauma rooms. And luckily they're pretty good sized, but it was challenging, to limit the staff and to figure out how to have clean staff on the outside and potentially contaminated staff on the inside, what to do with all of the equipment. So we did, rearrange some things to make sure we had, jump kits and processes for clean staff, clean runners. Then one of the other big challenges is communication. So how were the staff in the room going to be able to communicate with staff outside of the room to say like, hey, I need this, or can you get me that? So we used baby monitors initially, that was the first thing. People just said, let's bring in baby monitors. And we did that. And we ended up going to, walkie-talkies or other alternative communication devices. But that was one of the big challenges for us. And then just figuring out a new way of doing things, so staff get muscle memory. They know that trauma room inside and out. They know where everything is. And all of a sudden everybody was confused and where's my equipment and what am I supposed to be doing now? And overall capacity, I think, for surge patients is an issue, especially with the waiting rooms. And that's kind of another important space for the emergency department is the waiting room. So, we have challenges with transferring patients out. So we have, sometimes critical patients that are in our spaces for long periods of time. And so we end up running a waiting room quite a bit. And so how do you keep those infectious patients separate from the other patients in the waiting room? We actually ended up creating a negative pressure space in our waiting room with a tent. So we basically have an isolation tent that's there right now. We're actually looking at ways of creating a space that's more permanent, designed for the future, so that we're able to sort of separate the potentially infectious from the rest of the ED population. And curtains were a big thing too. So all the fabric curtains, were potentially contaminated. Normally, when you have an isolation patient, you take all those curtains down at the end of the case and you wash them and you put them back up. So potentially every time a COVID suspect patient came in, poor EVS staff was taking the curtains down, washing them, putting them back up. They were going a little bit nutty. Eventually, we ended up just getting a vinyl curtain that's like a clean in place solution, so that you didn't have to worry about that sort of risk. So those are kind of our pain points that we went through.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you.
John, I know
Yes.
Bob has to leave a bit early. If you could jump to him next, skip ahead.
Okay, Bob Seeger, who's the Executive Director of the ED at Mass General. Hey, Bob.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for jumping out of order, but I do have to leave a little early. First of all, it's great to see everyone, and several of you have been colleagues or are colleagues, so I really appreciate that. We're very similar to many of the comments. We currently have 14 negative pressure rooms in our emergency department, but they're completely scattered throughout the ED, and they're not in the area where we treat our sickest patients, our acute area, which is an 18-bed area in our emergency department. That, during the pandemic, ended up being a huge problem, and we had to try to manage the best we could in that area. We have 3 huge positive pressure rooms in that area that are trauma rooms, and we ended up making those regular pressure rooms. We got a DPH waiver to do that during the pandemic, and we made them just normal, standard, regular pressure so that we could at least utilize those rooms for pandemic patients. One thing I just wanted to mention, and so we're along with everyone. We also have a request and a major $2 million capital budget request in to make all the rest of those 18 rooms negative pressure. And it's too bad that we have to sort of retro engineer that now, but we want to be able to make them negative pressure. And, many of you are architects, and you know the difference between a negative pressure room and a true AII room. Ideally, we would go full blown AII with integrated ceilings and floors and everything else that goes into that. I'm not sure we're going to actually be able to do that. The other part of that is actually having space for donning and doffing. That was a very, very big deal during Ebola. We created one room with specific space for donning and doffing. And if we were redesigning our ED, not only would we have many, many more negative pressure rooms, but we would have specific areas for donning and doffing too. And just finally, really, we realized during the beginning of the pandemic that PPE was in short supply. And we have PPE available in carts and bins everywhere throughout the ED. We don't want our clinicians to have to search for it. But during the pandemic, because it was so limited, we had to pull all of our N95 masks, some of our gowns and so forth it was actually the N95 masks, into centralized areas. So we had to take over space and create an exchange program for all of our N95s. We were one of the hospitals that was using a outside firm to sterilize our N95s. And that whole process of having a central place in your very tight, overcrowded emergency department for a PPE exchange area was incredibly challenging, and it's not the way we normally practice. Thankfully, we've done away with that, but it was something to think about if we ever get to a point where PPE is incredibly limited again, and we're having now supply chain issues. There may need to be a different way of thinking in terms of being able to store and release our PPE. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So basically you want 50% more space for the ED is what I'm hearing.
Thanks, John. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Bob. Let's go back to Malcolm Creighton, who's the division chair in the hospital-based specialties and department chair of emergency medicine at Beth Israel Lahey.
Good morning.
Hi,
I'm out at Lahey Hospital Medical Center. I serve not only as chair of the ER, because that wasn't enough fun, I became chair of hospital-based specialties, which includes anesthesia, radiology, pathology, and the emergency department. I also serve as the chair of the emergency preparedness committee. And so I was really served as deputy incident commander for 18 months. And I used to have blonde hair at the start of the pandemic. you know, as we thought this through, and in 2017, we opened a brand new emergency department. We thought we had thought of everything. We had 44 treatment spaces, 5 pods, and you know, you don't know what you have until something goes wrong. And certainly some challenges through the pandemic. So I thought about, you know, if I was back 8 years from now or 8 years ago, and what would I have designed differently now knowing what I did? I think one thing that we did have an advantage of is that we had 2 smoke compartments, and we were able to break our emergency department into 2 areas, and we called them COVID and Novid. And unfortunately, the smoke compartments and the HVAC didn't quite line up entirely, which would have been an advantage. I wish we'd really incorporated those 2 when we made the design. That would have been an improvement. The other thing that I probably would have done differently is to create a corridor or a main street around the treatment areas so that we could transit from one treatment area to another without going through it, much akin to, you know, having a bedroom that you have to go through 2 bedrooms to get to the bathroom was how we were sort of feeling about that. So that would have been one thing we would have done differently, is to put a corridor around, or an access portal around the emergency department going through there. And then I think the other thing, and we'll probably touch on a lot of these things from different people, but being able to split the patient flow right from the front into, you know, right, left, and in and out for patients with suspected ILI symptoms, et cetera. I think everybody thinks of the in, but we don't necessarily think of the out when we're exiting patients, because we're so happy they're leaving that we don't think about that, but you need an exit path as well. So those are just 3 things that came to my mind when I was trying to answer this. Thanks very much for inviting me. Happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Malcolm. Brian Young, Director of Clinical Operations in the ED at Mass General. Hi,
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. So yeah, I am the Clinical Director for the Emergency Department at MGH. I work very closely with Bob Seeger, who gave a nice summary of some of the issues that we came across during COVID-19. Just for folks who may not be familiar with MGH in terms of the stats, we see 110,000 patients a year with an admit rate about 25 to 30%. We have a separate 31-bed ED observation unit that's 12 floors up, that's managed and run by the emergency department. And really, Bob had mentioned a number of the lessons that we had learned, but just to add sort of 2 additional things to that bucket is, one is we use a split flow process here at MGH. So patients come, they get evaluated by clinicians, and it's determined that if a patient is well enough to sit in a chair, then we put them in this treatment waiting area as opposed to occupying a stretcher. And prior to COVID-19, we could fit about 40 to 15 patients in this specific area. But then suddenly, with the need for distancing and for precautions, that amount of the capacity dropped down to about 20 to 25 patients. And so suddenly this high throughput area with low admission rate, high discharge rate, we had challenges in terms of getting it clean in a timely process. So we had to station an environmental services person to help clean that area as soon as a patient left. But then that brought additional challenges of where do we station the cleaning products? Where do we station the hand washing areas? And so that had to be worked out with our environmental services. The second thing is that related to, and it ties to both EHR sort of unexpected downtimes and precautions, but after the major COVID-19 surges, the hallway patients returned. And then that brought additional challenges related to keeping track of an individual's precaution status in a given hallway. And while prior sort of solutions and fixes were sort of signs hung on stretchers saying that they were contact precautions and so forth, it continues to be a challenge of how do we maintain staff safety and patient safety in a crowded emergency department, trying to balance both the patient precautions, but also capacity and our ability to see patients in a timely manner.
Thank you, Brian. David, I realized I jumped over you. I'm sorry about that. Bob threw our schedule off.
No problem
anyway.
at all. We can blame Bob.
Yeah.
Yes,
blame Bob.
Thank
David
you.
Huckins,
I'm
yes.
the interim chair of Emergency Medicine at New Wellesley Hospital. And I'll reiterate many of the things that others have said, but just as a matter of background. So we're a ED with 36 licensed beds. We have 22 expansion or overflow beds. It includes hallway beds, which we're all using now, obviously. And there's also an 8-bed observation unit behind the ED, which is normally staffed by the hospitalist service, but we are currently using that as overflow. We see approximately 55 to 60,000 patients a year was our normal volume. And I'll start with what Joan said about the transmission in the waiting room, and others have mentioned as well. I think that was one of the main concerns that we had, was that patients while in the waiting room were transmitting COVID to each other. And if there were a way to design a waiting room so that there was an area of segregation or isolation out front in the waiting room for febrile respiratory illness, and this applies not only to the COVID, but during flu season as well. I mean, I'm concerned about flu transmission during a normal winter season as well, as another issue. The other thing is what Bob had mentioned and everyone else has mentioned, actually, is space and the issue of space. Now, paradoxically, during the first wave of COVID, our volume dropped by about 40%. So space was not an issue then. However, during this last wave of Delta, which I guess you would say is the third or fourth wave, and as it is abating, we are now dealing with a severe capacity crisis where many, if not all of us, are finding our EDs overloaded, and we're trying to find extra space for these patients. And finding that expansion or overflow space is a challenge. For instance, our extra overflow space we use is our GI unit. Now, our GI unit happens to be 2.5 floors below us. So it's challenging for us to overflow into the GI unit, even when that space is available. And one of the important concepts for any service provider or any business for that matter is that when you're having trouble meeting the demand, one of the issues you want to most avoid is to have underutilized or unutilized capacity. And when you think about it, units, for instance, like the GI suite that we use, or even the recovery room or the post-care anesthesia unit, as we call it, or other procedural suites, these are typically often used primarily during regular business hours, and during the weekends or the nights or even the evening shifts, this is often unused space. And I think in designing a new ED to conceptually have those spaces in proximity to the ED so that when they are unutilized, they are accessible for overflow, that would be a huge step forward so that we have space to expand into when we have these kind of capacity crises that we're dealing with now. So I think that concept of putting these underutilized spaces during these time periods in close proximity to the ED as you would design a new ED would be hugely beneficial. For instance, the GI suite that we use, if it were right next to ED design-wise, then we would have much easier access to that space to utilize that when we need to.
Thanks, David. And next up, we have Arjun Kintashish, who's the Chief and Section of Administration Associate Professor at Department of Emergency Medicine at Yale School of Medicine.
Hey, everyone.
Arjun.
Nice to meet you all. Arjun Venkatesh from Yale. Just as some context for you all, we have out of our main hospital, 3 emergency departments: an academic site with 90,000 visits a year, a community site with about 60,000 visits a year, and a freestanding ED with about 30,000 visits a year. And I'll echo a few of the things people previously said, and then think about how we thought about things maybe a little bit differently. In many ways, our response and our capacity needs and our space needs as we have thought about COVID have been essentially unrelated to the pandemic. And that is because in many ways, Connecticut has had a remarkably successful effort when it comes to testing, mitigation strategies, vaccination. And so when I think about the COVID pandemic here, our worst 2 months of the pandemic were April and May of 2020. Those were also the 2 months where we had a 50% decline in ED visit volume. And so we were able to essentially compensate and provide room space for every COVID patient that was getting ultimately hospitalized. And we didn't have COVID patients in the hallway like others have said. We also at the time had no staffing problems. And so what that meant is that we were able to get lucky in that the worst parts of the pandemic, the times at which you wanted to space people out the most, was the time that we actually had the most space and the most number of healthcare workers. If we think about subsequent stages of the pandemic, though, the winter surge here, that winter surge was in hospitalization count, about a fifth of what we experienced in 20, and from a death count, a tenth of what we experienced in 2020. And then when people talk about the Delta surge, it essentially did not occur here. We never went above, I think, 20 hospitalizations for COVID across the entire Delta surge versus being at 600 last year. And so what that's meant, though, on the flip side has been that we had almost no operational stresses in that initial phase of the pandemic, yet in the most recent Delta surge, we've had our worst operational stresses, largely because we have around 3,000 vacancies across our health system. And so we have a remarkable amount of underutilized space. And so when we think about COVID and what we did to sort of improve the safety of the health environment, we really focused a lot, I would say, because the brunt of what we faced was early in the pandemic when we didn't know much about the virus, how it transmitted, how live droplets were for, whether or not there was aerosol-based transmission, or a variety of other things. We focused on physical distancing and we focused on de-densification of the environment. Those were things that we felt that were within our control. We could do them faster than building out flexible space. And we actually published on this. I put the link in the chat for folks. The thing I liked about this paper the best is that within it, we include essentially a list of almost, how we reapproached intubation. We essentially got specific to almost any clinical scenario that had an aerosol generating procedure about who would be in the room and who would be outside the room and what the role of each person would be. And by doing so, really we're able to reduce, by 60, 70% the amount of context that people had with patients. The other thing that we did, and this is sort of I think the lessons learned of this document, it's the second figure in there, is made a bunch of changes to triage, to clinical care, to how people think about their workday. We put Amazon Alexas in every room. We encourage both patients to talk to healthcare teams and healthcare teams to talk to patients in the ED using both video and voice for quick asks. Things like, oh, can I call your dad and let them know that you're here and how you're doing? And that had a huge impact because we were able to still connect with people, but do it in a way that did not introduce any infection transmission risk. We started to batch certain kinds of work, phlebotomy with respiratory therapy work, so that there was sort of room entry and exit happening at a limited number of times. We did a lot of work sort of redesigning how we would use space and where we would use space. We moved, obviously, we sort of tried to de-densify things like lunchrooms, workrooms. What we ended up finding looking back on the pandemic is almost all the healthcare worker acquisitions of COVID infections that occurred via home in our ED staff, both amongst physicians and nurses. It was not a workplace acquisition of infection. And on the first year experience, when we look back across our health system at almost any healthcare worker COVID transmission that happened in the workplace, almost all of it happened in lunchrooms and break rooms. So places where you essentially could not control masks and could not control droplets. And we took those learnings to kind of keep contributing to how we did things. And I think that that is in many ways how we were successful in sort of making for a safer healthcare environment and doing so without sort of the spend that would go with negative pressure rooms and things like that, given that we just didn't have the financial flexibility to do that.
So Arjun, you're giving space back then from the ED is what I hear.
We did at the time, not anymore. Now it's we're building tents in parking lots.
Oh, I want to come back to the tents and parking lots. That's an interesting discussion. I want to commend you all. You did a great job of keeping to the schedule that we laid out and a lot of information transferred. Let's hear from the architect, Sarah Markovitz, from principal at MBBJ.
Sure. So just one thing I heard from several of you was your real interest in perhaps being able to separate out febrile patients from non-sick patients in your waiting rooms. And just something that we've learned during this work is that is common in some hospitals in China to have kind of a sick entry, a fever entry, and a non-fever entry. And I think that's really something we should maybe look at as we look to future design of emergency entrances, although I really appreciate that thought that we have to think about the exits as well as the entrances. So I think that's good for us to think about. In terms of PPE and management of PPE, I think that's something that we're starting to see is just a standard detail of having a PPE cabinet closet at the entrance to every patient room. And it's inpatient units, but I think also we're starting to do that in all the EDs that we're designing, as well as now we've had requests for doing that in clinics as well. So that might be part of our future. And then maybe just one more thing is about the just communication and telemedicine, and are we preparing our rooms for each exam room in the ED for telemedicine as well. So part of the future is virtual health and being able to keep providers out of the rooms. Maybe that's one way to protect staff as we go into the future.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Ron Gorham, principal at Perkins and Will.
Okay, I'm off mute now. Great. Sarah, I agree with everything that you've said, and it's quite obvious now that no matter if you have 30,000 visits or 130,000 visits, everybody seems to have dealt with the same conditions. Some other points that haven't really been touched upon, but certainly important in lessons learned from this COVID, because of staff reductions that we've experienced, whether through retirement or just having enough, or because of illness, it's become important to make sure that we have improved sight lines for visibility in our spaces, and that we take advantage of it, as well as looking at our workflows, the pathways for support as well as for patients. That had been touched upon previously, but I think it's important as we think about how patients move through space. Another element that's also becoming more prevalent is the fact that we still have behavioral health patients come through. And there seems to be a higher volume of it these days, both in adult and PD. And not all emergency departments do have a true designated behavioral health pod, but we could certainly cluster spaces that could be flexible with gas devices and wall devices behind, whether it's a garage door or a panel or something, so that you could flex and use that space for a behavioral health patient down the road. Ventilation concepts, a lot of facilities did put temporary measures in during the course of COVID. But now that we seem to be coming out of this last wave of COVID, people are now looking back at how can we improve our ventilation strategies in the emergency department, whether it's for infectious patients in the waiting room or even in the emergency department itself. If you have pods or clusters of pods and bays of, let's say, 20, 20, 20, maybe looking at ventilation strategies so you can pressurize them differently throughout the course. So those are some of the quick hit elements that I picked up from what I heard. And then, of course, we have staff experience and patient experience. If we can identify space throughout the facility that we can use that have means to outdoor light, just open space, because we can use that as respite for both patients and for staff. So a comment made earlier about the waiting rooms, very important today, that they become right-sized. There was, this idea and concept of we got to space people 6 feet apart, and now we need more space. But the reality was, to the comment made earlier, they're still no longer 6 feet apart today. However, there's a lot more patients inside the space, and some of the earlier emergency departments have tighter waiting space. So can we take advantage of outdoor space in the nicer weather? Can we expand tents out there? Can we do something to just improve the overall experience? So those are some of the quick hits. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Teresa, if you could help with questions and observations that are coming in through chat and manage that piece of it. But I wanted to go back to something that a couple of folks touched on, which is, you really don't know who's coming in the front door, right? And so during the peak of COVID, at least, there was an attempt to triage even before persons got inside the front door, right? And in some instances, tents were set up and a number of other temporary accommodations for suspected COVID patients. Obviously, regular ED patients need to still have access to the ED. So I think we've touched on a couple of things, but I'd like to have a bit of a talk, if we could, about some observations about how we might better triage coming in before you get inside the building. Or are you comfortable that it's okay to let COVID and flu patients and everybody else in the front door and kind of deal with them once you're inside the controlled space, or should there be some other approach to how we do this? I mean, almost like a greeter before you actually get to the front door. I mean, it could be inside some kind of accommodation, or are temporary accommodations like tents in our future, and that we really need to be making an allowance in and around the ED for the use of temporary structures. And my experience is once you put up a temporary structure, it becomes a permanent structure. So, and I don't think we all want to have tents sitting outside the front door, but something like that. Anybody want to sort of grab a hold of that and start a discussion?
I'll take the first stab at it.
Go ahead, Alan.
So one of the problems with that, like we can use a virtual triage system. That's one of the things that we started to do was we had a sign outside and ask people to call our triage or our greeter to actually explain the symptoms that they had before coming in. And if they had suspected COVID symptoms, we would actually keep them outside until we had a room prepared for them. Then we would bring them directly through our ambulance doors and not through the waiting room to a room that was sequestered for our COVID patients. But you run a limitation. That was easy to do, when our volumes were 46% of what they normally are. Right now, we're actually seeing a rise in COVID numbers, and our volumes are about 105, 110% of what they were pre-COVID. And so it's something that is virtually impossible for us to do. Last night, our waiting room was overflowing, and you could see that we had 5 COVID positive patients out there because they'd done home tests. And our ability to actually keep them out of the department, we just don't have the manpower, and we also don't have the structure. Like you said, you build a tent and it becomes permanent. Also up in New Hampshire, you only have a few months of the year that you can be outside in a tent. So you're actually building another structure, which would be one of those not really well-used spaces during a time of non-pandemic or non-heightened work. You'd have this extra space that I don't know that you'd get a lot out of. And so it's not something that I know my hospital would really be paying for.
Sarah mentioned, I guess, China, right? Where they have a, what would it be? What was it, Sarah? There's a
They segregate entries at some of their emergency departments. So there's an entry for people who know that they've got fever or respiratory illnesses, okay, and those who don't. So people kind of self-triage. I think they self-triage going through the right door.
Does that make sense? Or some other approach like that?
Yeah.
Go ahead, David.
If I could.
Sorry, David. David was just going to speak, and then Joan.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. I would add another element of the lessons learned through the pandemic. Someone asked in the chat, how will we deal with the next pandemic, and what will the next pandemic be? Well, I'll make a prediction that the next pandemic will be flu, because flu is far more common. It happens every year, and that's probably going to be the next pandemic. And what did we learn through COVID? We saw virtually no influenza last year because of all the precautions we took for COVID. That means masks work. So one of the things that we could do is make sure that any patient, but particularly the febrile respiratory illness patient, everyone gets masked before they step through the door into the waiting room. So if there was some mechanism by which we could achieve that simple intervention, that would be probably the biggest return on investment of any of the things we could do that we're talking about.
Okay. Joan?
Sure. I just wanted to mention one of the things we did really well in the beginning to limit the exposure in the waiting room was first we put up that tent that gave us, the sick waiting room versus the non-sick waiting room. But we stationed a nurse basically right at the front door. So before you walked in, you saw the nurse. The nurse triaged your symptoms and decided you're going right into the tent, or you're going to go, you're safe to go to another area. So we had a nurse greeter. At the time, we had enough staff to do that, and that actually worked really, really well. Of course, now the staffing shortage is real, and the patient volume is back. We also saw a decrease in volume, back in March, April of 2020, but now everybody's back with a vengeance. and the staffing is short. So we weren't able to continue to have that nurse greeter at the front anymore, but that was something that worked really well, because you never know what's walking through the front door, and you can't really rely upon the patients to self-triage as effectively as you'd like them to. But that having that greeter there who is clinical really helped reduce the exposures in the waiting room.
John, we've heard a lot about staff shortages, and that might lead to Dr. Venkatesh's question about how do you provide strategies for people to be able to have respite spaces, eating, and just taking breaks, and how does that work during a pandemic and with the space that you have or what you need, I think is.
Anybody want to tackle that? I saw something, perhaps it was New York Presbyterian. It looked like they had a tent up on a roof somewhere, and it was kind of it looked like a Moroccan smoking pit or something. It was very old-fashioned, let's put it that way. But it seemed like it was used quite a bit with lights and candles and all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, that may be not exactly what you have in mind, but certainly the idea is that there was a place for staff to go and basically get away and recharge their battery for a little while.
Yeah. We are working with some clients that are trying to capture roof space and make roof gardens within it, not only for healing spaces for patients and on one particular garden, but another roof garden that's being done just for staff and family members who could just walk right through and hang out there, which is all well during the nicer weather. When the cold weather comes, there is some discussion about actually putting heating lamps and things of that nature out there.
Yeah, we created a respite space on our floors. So the inpatient units had a respite space. It was a little bit far away for the ED, and we were just so jammed for space in the ED. We couldn't find a location close enough for them. But I will say that they did make use of the space. When they had time, they did go up and use the inpatient space, for some quiet time, just to disconnect a little bit. So those respite spaces are super important, and they were very well received by our staff.
Shortly after 9/11, a lot of the hospitals were creating these areas for mass decontamination zones, right? And sally ports or things of that nature. You could actually just set and line people through and go through. Those have actually turned out to be beneficial during COVID, because not that we were necessarily decontaminating patients, but it became a separate means of entry to the emergency department. B, that they could actually enclose them and convert them into patient care space on a temporary basis, even if it's for testing or if it's even for triaging. And who knows now, depending on its location, can it be used for other means of space for staff or other functions? And then it's also important to know that whether it's mass disaster trailers or anything of that needs, but you could even have your COVID testing trailers that come through. You need this. It'd be great to have outdoor connections, right, for water or for power. So just to think about that in the future.
Can we talk about hallway patients and sort of how you dealt with hallway patients' concerns about infection spread of patients out in the hallway? I know none of us like having hallway patients, but the reality is there's always going to be hallway patients, right? So what's your thinking about that, ways to provide some level of protection for hallway patients and staff, although presumably you're not putting in an infected patient out there, they could be exposed to infected patients or staff, right? Yep, Arjun?
There's one thing we did. I think we did it pretty well during COVID. We do it less well now, but it sort of reverses the culture and thinking in most emergency departments that I think helped in this space. And that was that we said the hallways are for admitted patients. And the reason is that a new patient coming in is undifferentiated. We do universal COVID screening of all of our admitted patients. And so I know amongst all the admitted patients that almost everybody doesn't have COVID, and I've proved it with a test. I also know that almost nobody that working in my ED has COVID. And so we tried to push a philosophy, and it is remarkably hard to do because we have normalized putting low acuity patients from vulnerable and marginalized groups in the hallway for decades in our emergency department. And it worked during a portion of the pandemic where people were worried about healthcare worker safety and were more worried about horizontal transmission in the ED, where we would basically take the low acuity ankle sprain who came in the waiting room, would get the bed, and the 84-year-old woman from a nursing home who has cognitive impairment and is bedbound was put in the hallway. And that goes counter to the nursing work that's going to be done. It goes counter to a bunch of other things that we do. But at the time, there was a compelling sort of reason to do it because people felt that that was the safe way to reduce infection transmission. Most of that practice, I'll be honest, has unwound itself as we've sort of not had COVID around here for some months. And so it's really hard to like make meaningful permanent changes that way, but that was something that transiently worked for us.
John, I would add one other thing in relation to protecting patients and staff regarding the patients that are in the hallway, and that would be obviously the ideal situation would be to get them out of the hallway. And that leads back to one of the other things that I mentioned before is proximity of overflow and expansion space. That during COVID, you could start putting these patients in rooms or spaces that otherwise were not used rather than hallways.
Well, I'm sure everybody would like to have some expansion space or overflow space nearby. And, you know, and I guess that, I mean, that really is the world of architecture and planning, right? It's those of us who are sort of looking bigger picture at what's going on around the ED need to be thinking about flex spaces and what we locate next to the ED. And, you know, oftentimes we're putting radiology and a bunch of other stuff, imaging in there, which obviously that's not flex space, or else it's officing and support services for the ED. So it's a significant challenge, but also, you know, what you are voicing and several of you have voiced, you know, I think it's a need that perhaps needs to be better documented in terms of planning requirements and workflow and how you deal with overflow situations in general.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just following up on that, John, you know, because basically an exam treatment room from an ED is the same thing as a peri-op bay, which is not much different than an exam room. So, you know, how can we be smarter about that? Yeah.
I think just moving on, I think Brian mentioned sort of vertical and horizontal patients, and you know, to what degree are you relying on caring for patients vertically? Let's put it that way, and keeping them out of a bay and off a stretcher. And what should be your experience, Brian, to start with?
Yeah, so about 30 to 40% of our patients are seen in this treatment area where people sit in chairs. As I mentioned, as Bob mentioned, we have 62 monitored spaces, but see volumes of 320, 330 in a given day. If you look at our census, we are 100% of the time, we have more patients in the ED than we have bays, monitored bays, 100% of the time. And so this area has allowed us to move patients through the system and be seen. But certainly there's always a challenge of scope creep, because it's like you don't have a bed, so what's the second best? And it may be a stretcher, a hallway, using a stretcher, putting in the hallway space in the treatment area. And no one likes that, but the counter argument is it better for the patient to wait 6-8 hours in the waiting room? And we feel that it's better that they're seen rather than wait 6 to 8 hours in the waiting room. And so during the initial COVID surges, we put up plexiglass to provide some separation between patients, but we've removed those because our volume again has surged. We are working on renovating that area actually to try to focus a little bit more on comfort and privacy. It's a little bit of like the first class in an airplane issue, right? We're trying to sort of maximize the number of patients that we can see, but that may not be the most comfortable. On the flip side, we're looking at these designs to say, can we use more recliners to provide additional comfort for our patients as opposed to sitting straight up for 48 hours waiting for a bed. And I think as at least the guidelines are coming out related to what is a semi-private subacute treatment space area. Certainly the sketches were pre-COVID, and so now we're going to need to incorporate, what does precautions look like in these subacute semi-private treatment spaces, and how do we include some infection control measures so that these little pods who will by definition have faster turnaround times, shorter length of stays, can be maintained easily, cleaned easily, and with the primary use of recliners. And the other thing is that, with the thought is like these are used for ESI 4s or 5s, but most often they're used for ESI 3 patients, right? And so these patients will have IVs. They will have medications being delivered through their IVs, and then waiting for radiologic images.
Any other folks have experience with sort of keeping patients vertical? No. Teresa, I know there's a bunch of chat in there, but I haven't had a chance to look at it. There may be some questions you would like to pass along.
So there's a couple. What we just heard from Dr. Yoon was Marvina Williams had something, was really talking about that same thing of how do you have privacy and separation. I think that was answered a little bit. I don't know if anybody has any other comments on that. And then there's a question from Wendy. Are you familiar with the pods for vertical patients example at Northwestern? So I don't know if anybody has knowledge of that.
I can add to that a little bit. We actually have that in our waiting room right now. We created these pods to screen patients and largely get the diagnostic process started, blood work, imaging orders, et cetera. And many of these patients now are ending up back in the waiting room with IVs as vertical patients. So creating an actually designated space for the vertical patient with the IV that's waiting for some of these results, I think is an important concept that should be explored and incorporated into future design.
David, you're talking about essentially an interior waiting room, correct?
Essentially, yes. People who are waiting at this point now for results rather than just waiting to be seen.
And this is Wendy Weitzner. There's some, I was trying to figure out how I could post an image into the chat, but these pods are kind of cool that they're smaller than a regular room, that they could be used for the vertical patients. They have a curtain in the front, but they're like 60 square feet. So in theory, if you're trying to squeeze some more in, it's a way to make it comfortable yet semi-private. And I'll see if I can figure out how to paste a picture in.
Yeah, the ones we're using, I think, are roughly probably 8 by 8 square feet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the questions, Dominic, from Maine Medical asked was mentioned that how they dealt with some of the staffing issues during the pandemic of using other spaces, conference rooms, and staggering schedules and things like that. And is that something that should be permanently considered as that, making a larger space than necessary next to a ED that can be repurposed during non-pandemic times, looking at the adjacency issues that John spoke to? Maybe Sarah, if you've been seeing any of that?
Well, I think we've seen concerns about planning. So, just thinking about flexible space throughout the hospital, and maybe that's part of a plan that we deliver is that just making hospitals aware of all of the flexible space that they've got, you know, all the little hidden conference rooms and break rooms and multi-purpose rooms that are that can be thoughtfully reused as needed at these kind of times. But I think people are reluctant to build additional space that might not. I think what we're hearing is every space should be multi-purpose, as flexible as possible, so that it's never underutilized at any time, is pretty much the going request.
Yep.
Well, you know, that sounds like a good theme to end on. I think we're coming up on the hour, and so as architects and engineers, we need to be designing flexible spaces. We certainly need to recognize the spaces, the types of spaces that are surrounding the ED to try and promote, obviously, with the involvement of the ED administration, the kind of flexibility that we've talked about here, the triaging at the front door, before the front door, inside the front door. It sounds like it's still a challenge, figuring out how to direct fever and non-fever patients, perhaps. Just going back to the case that Sarah mentioned, challenges in the waiting room, right? Just because you've just got all kinds of folks with all kinds of conditions in the waiting room, and I don't quite know how we deal with that other than making more specialized types of waiting rooms for patients with specific conditions, which I guess is possible. I mean, we sort of did that a little bit with COVID patients. And then, you know, something that I think everybody spoke to is the need for, if not more AIA rooms, certainly more negative pressure rooms. And whether it's every bay or whether it's some number of, you know, a majority of bays, I guess we'll get that figured out. And I'm sure that FGI will be providing some direction around that as well. Thank you, everybody, especially thank you to all the panelists who joined us. This was really a great discussion. Hope you got as much out of it as our architects and engineers did, and have a great day. Thank you.